Kathy asked me to come and speak today because after I retired, I started giving some talks on meditation, which is a long-time interest of mine personally, but as a physician, I used it with a few patients, but didn't do it as much as I wanted to. And my real interest recently has been in understanding more about how meditation works and how it can be used as a healthcare intervention. So we've had a lot of interest in meditation in recent years. We have these 1,000-year-old traditions. We have a real versioning of science, particularly science of the brain, neuroscience. And we have this frenetic culture that we live in that pushes everybody to the extremes, and it's amazing that our brains still work. And this has all come together into what some people call mindful revolution, a lot of interest in meditation in recent times, and we're seeing a lot about that. And there's also, along with that, in the science in particular, there's a lot of research that's been done on meditation, and particularly mindfulness meditation, which is a particular type of meditation that's been developed in the last 30 or 40 years. And it's really the bulk of a lot of the recent research, and I'm going to talk mostly about studies that have to do with that. What is meditation? Well, that's an intriguing question and a difficult one to answer. There are a lot of different traditions and techniques and goals. We know that there are different forms of meditation. There's Zen meditation where somebody's sitting very still. We have something like Tai Chi, which is a movement type of meditation, and yoga, which is more static position. From a scientific perspective, meditation could be viewed as a kind of deliberate self-regulation that we can do for various purposes to control consciousness or emotions in various ways. One of the distinctions that's made in terms of meditating is the difference between the state, what you're doing right now, versus a trait. What happens after you meditate for maybe 8 weeks or 10 years or 20 or 30 years? Does it change the way that we actually are? And there's some evidence that it does. And one of the main models or ways that meditation is done and taught is called mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR. We'll talk quite a bit about this. It was developed in the 1970s at University of Massachusetts Medical Center, and it's been the predominant form of meditation research, at least in recent studies. There are a lot of types of meditation that have been studied. There's an intriguing study that was done just a few years ago, and basically what they did was to look at how often people's minds wander, and they used this iPhone app. I don't know if everybody knows what that would mean, but basically something you can put on your phone, and they recruited on the internet about 5,000 people from a lot of different countries and a lot of ages, and it would ask at random times of the day on your phone, how are you feeling right now? What are you doing right now? And are you thinking about something other than what you're currently doing? And if you are, that's mind wandering. So in this study, they got a lot of different, it would ask what they're doing, and it got a lot of different activities that people do. So this is a scale of happiness down here, and this is various activities. So people, when they're working, are not as happy as when they're exercising or making love, for example. And when you look at all of the various states that people are in, here's mind wandering from pleasant to unpleasant thoughts, and here's not mind wandering at all. And you can see that not mind wandering is actually better in terms of happiness than any level of mind wandering. So when you're paying attention to what you're doing, generally you're going to be in a better mood than you would be if your mind was off of that. And mind wandering is quite common. Almost 50% of the samples had people's minds wandering when they reported in. As I mentioned, they're generally less happy than when their minds were wandering than when they were not. They had a lot of samples, so looking at kind of which comes first, it actually looks statistically like mind wandering comes before the unhappiness. not that the unhappiness comes before the mind wandering. Now, this is statistics. It can't tell you cause and effect, but it suggests that mind wandering is associated with a more unhappy level of affect or how you feel. There are some cautions. We have to be careful because in this study they had no controls, and we'll talk about why that's important later on. We don't know who these people are. These 5,000 people from all over the world may have been very different from us, and mind wandering is an entirely natural thing, so we definitely don't want to demonize mind wandering. It's just an interesting observation. In terms of what goes on when your mind wanders, this wasn't really understood until probably about 20 years ago, because there were lots of studies of people's brains, but the thing that they didn't really look at is what's the brain doing when it's not focused on anything in particular, like you're not doing something, but you're just daydreaming or thinking. And this, what they found out is that 80% of the brain metabolism is actually devoted to this state of not doing anything in particular, but just letting your mind, do its thing. So, evolutionarily, we have to believe that this state is very, very important. It wasn't just a mistake. The actual function in that state is not clear, but it's known that it's very important for the health of the brain. Probably has to do with our stream of consciousness, planning, creativity. And we also know that in certain states like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression, there are changes from normal in that system. And also, just to make the point again, that thinking is not the enemy. It's definitely a normal thing, but as we saw in the previous in the previous study, that mind wandering definitely can be associated with some negative consequences. So if a wandering mind might be a more unhappy mind in some ways, what's the alternative? And there's the term mindfulness that's currently being used a lot, and there are a lot of definitions of mindfulness. I tend to think of mindfulness as really being aware of what you're doing while you're doing it. And it's also helpful to have an open and kind orientation to what you're doing too. Not that that creates mindfulness, but it definitely helps to support it. Because if you're not comfortable with what's going on in your mind, you're probably going to be moving your mind around and being less happy with it. The Chinese characters, by the way, for mindfulness are basically, this is present moment, this upper character here, and this is heart-mind. So it's the sense of your heart-mind, kind of your whole sense of being in the present moment. Mindfulness is on a continuum. You can be relatively more or less mindful. So if you're driving your car and you're talking to somebody, you may not be paying 100% of your attention on driving, maybe 50%, or maybe 10%. Look out. On the other hand, you might be paying a lot of attention on something that you're doing. Maybe you're doing some woodworking or knitting or something like that, and you're really engaged in that. And the ability to be mindful is something that we all do. It's nothing unusual for us, and it can be improved by practicing. And that's really about where meditation comes in. One of the metaphors that's used for meditation is the idea of clouds in the sky. In a way, our mind, we have a lot of thinking that goes on, and a lot of times we tend to associate with the thinking, if you want to think of that as the clouds. But what we're really interested in is the awareness that goes on behind that might be viewed as the sky. So when you where is thinking happening in your experience? And as soon as you become aware of your thinking, there's the awareness too. It's, who's watching the store? Who knows what's going on? We also have the sense in meditation and trying to be more mindful of letting the mind settle naturally. We're not trying to touch our thinking, we're trying to just leave it alone. And that's difficult at first, but we eventually get the hang of it. And as we do that, we just kind of leave our thinking alone, the mind tends to settle out and become more clear. Not that it's going to be clear all the time or that we're trying to force it to be clear, but that's something that's almost a byproduct of just being more aware of what's going on in our minds. There are certain helpful orientations in meditation. One, and probably the most important one, is intention. We intend to pay attention to our minds. We often probably don't do that, but in meditation, that's really the intention. Intention doesn't mean that we force it or that's going to happen 100%, but that's just the direction that we're going in. We also have a notion of what's called the beginner's mind. Usually as we go through life, we become more expert at doing things, and we learn a lot of things. But when we meditate, we're really bringing a mind that's very fresh. Sometimes people talk about living life as though it's the last moment of your life. How would you do that? But in meditation, it's almost the opposite. How would it be if I lived this moment as though it were the first moment of my life, and I were very fresh, kind of like a baby, very open-minded, and don't know mind, which means that I look at things without a lot of biases, a lot of preconceptions. I'm willing to open my mind more. And finally, compassion is very useful. In other words, being kind to myself. I start to let my mind settle, and all of a sudden there's a whole flurry of thoughts or emotions, and I'm kind to that. I'm not trying to force my mind into a particular state, but I actually, by leaving my mind alone in a way, by letting it just do its thing, it actually begins to settle on its own. And that's a kind of a leap of faith, but it's something that you begin to learn as you do meditation. And so I wanted to just give you, if you haven't done meditation, or even if you have, just to do a little guided meditation for a few minutes. And we're not going to spend a lot of time, but I want you to just, if you're willing and game for this, to just settle in and make yourself comfortable. And for this exercise, I would suggest just closing your eyes. And maybe for the first time in a while, coming into your direct, immediate experience of what it's like to be here, right here in your body, right now. And you can be aware of parts of your body you may not even be aware of, the space between your toes, what it feels like between your foot and your leg, where your ankle is. And we can just come up through the body, through the legs and the thighs and the area around your pelvis and the low back, the middle and upper back, the area of our stomach and our chest, our neck and our head and our face. And just paying attention like this actually begins to evoke a new sense or relationship to your experience. And you can also pay more attention to your breathing. Breathing is a very natural process that's going on. A lot of times we're not aware of our breathing. It might be shallow, it might be deep or comfortable. There may be some tension there. We're not trying to force any particular feeling, but we allow what's there just to be noticed, to breathe and know you're breathing. That's really what the mindfulness is about. And you may notice that thoughts come into your mind. That's completely natural. And as that happens, just for this exercise, you could bring your attention very gently, kindly back to your breathing. That focuses our awareness on breathing. So this is a very simple practice. You could do this at home, for example. It's just, or let's say you're standing in line and you could just pay attention. How's my body right now? What's my breathing doing? Can I let my attention go on my breathing? And if my mind begins to wander, and I notice that it's wandering, can I just simply come back to the breathing? So I'll just invite you to come back here, to open your eyes, come back to this room. So that's a little bit of meditation experience. And there are a lot of misconceptions and myths about meditation. This young lady is saying, I realize I've only been at it for 5 minutes, but meditation isn't bringing me the peace of mind I was promised. So we don't make any promises here. And some of those myths are, I should meditate. Well, you usually find out by noticing if you are meditating. If you're not, then you probably shouldn't be meditating, at least at that moment. Meditation is really something, it should be a gentle thing and a friendly thing to do. It shouldn't be something to try to force into your schedule, but something, actually mindfulness can be done anytime, and it can be done in 3 minutes like we just did it. You don't have to do it as an actual practice. You can just do it whenever the urge comes up. I can meditate. I hope I showed you that that's actually not true. I have to empty my mind. My mind shouldn't wander. Actually, your mind will wander, and if you try to go to war with your mind, you will be very unhappy. Meditation is not about emptying your mind or making your mind blank or still or free of thoughts. It's really about the relationship that you have with what's going on in your mind. If you can have thoughts and be able to be with that, that's plenty. And that's a practice that you can do for the rest of your life. In the same way, I should always be calm and relaxed while meditating. Not if you're a human being. Human beings are not always calm or relaxed. So, again, meditating is about being with your experience, and it's not about trying to force something on your mind. And lastly, I don't have time to meditate. Again, you can do this any place. You can do this while you're in a checkout line. You can do this, while you're waiting for something. You're, at the DMV. You can do it in a lot of different settings. Mindfulness is not something that has to be restricted in any shape or form. So mindfulness is taught a lot in this country, and a lot, particularly, in a lot of areas, as mindfulness-based stress reduction. This program that was developed by actually a molecular biologist named John Kabat-Zinn. He went to MIT too, which was my alma mater, and I took a course from him a few years ago, and we compared some notes on our time at MIT, and then he got very interested in Zen, as I did too, and he studied with the same person I studied with. MBSR is it's a very full program. It consists of 8 weeks of 2.5-hour group sessions, and then a one-day all-day silent session in the 6th week. There are a number of different types of sitting and walking meditation and mindful yoga. And there have been a number of variations on the MBSR framework that have been developed, for example, for depression, we'll talk about later, and recently self-compassion. So what happens when you meditate? Well, the neuroscience suggests that we're paying attention to our breath, just as you were doing. That's in the frontal part of the brain, the part that's up towards the forehead. And then our mind begins to wander, and it goes into that default mode network we were talking about, and that's a number of these areas here towards the center part of the brain. And at some point, we kind of wake up. Wait, I'm not paying attention to my breath anymore. That's called the salience network, and that's some deep structures in the brain that notice that. And then as we reorient, we start to get those areas again that we're paying attention, and now we're back on track until it happens again. And that's what happens in meditation. If you do this kind of meditation, that's what happens. You just keep cycling. And you could be over here for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, or you might be there for 5 seconds. But this is the process that can happen as we meditate. Sounds pretty simple, but actually it's very powerful. There's a concept called neuroplasticity. They noticed, for example, in London cab drivers, that the area called the hippocampus, where they store a lot of the maps of London, is actually more dense, more developed than in other people. And people who are violinists, at least good violinists, they use their left hand for this very complex fingering, but they use their right hand for this very coarse bow movement. The left hand is connected to the right hemisphere of the brain, and that develops a great deal more density than the left hemisphere for the right side of the brain. What we're seeing is that the expression neurons that fire together, wire together. The more you use certain parts of the brain, the more they develop. We used to think that the brain basically creates the mind or our subjective experience, but what we've learned is that our subjective experience also creates the structure of the brain. It's a bidirectional process, and there is a sense of doing exercise with the brain and changing the brain in that process. So exercise and experience can change the brain. The question for us is, can meditation change our brains? Well, the evidence is that it can. So here's MBSR, that program that we talked about, versus people on a wait list. So let's say we take 50 people and 25 go into the MBSR group, but the other 25 wanted to do it, but they're asked to wait, say 8 weeks before they go into the program. They're going to be used as a control group that's not doing the MBSR. They practice almost half an hour a day for 8 weeks. They have significant improvements in their mindfulness scores, which you would hope for, but they also had changes. If you look at the brain, this area called the left hippocampus actually increased in its density, basically, a lot more than people who had not been meditating. And there are a number of other areas of the brain that showed this. So 8 weeks of half an hour a day of meditating had these significant effects of changing the structure of the brain. That's pretty amazing. And if you look at other changes, not only the areas that we talked about, but changes in activation of areas of the brain. And by the way, this is a Tibetan monk who has an EEG, or electrical recording system, on his brain. Increased efficiency of communication between brain regions. This is important for me. Decreased age-related atrophy or reduction in brain. So when they look at people who have meditated a long time, they seem to maintain their brain's volume. Let's see, yeah. And some of this is being understood through imaging studies, what they call, some of it is fMRI or functional MRI scans, where they can actually get real-time images of the brain. It's a little bit confusing. This is one study of many studies where they looked at, okay, so what did they find out? Well, they reported over 100 differences in these imaging studies of practitioners, but they found that only 8 of those regions were consistent amongst a lot of different studies. In other words, what we're seeing is that a lot of studies are reporting differences, and you see things in the newspaper, but when you actually look at consistent changes, far fewer of them seem to be, kind of bona fide changes, and a lot of the other ones may really be, it's hard to know. They may be artifacts or misleading changes. So at the moment, we're not sure what to make of all of the imaging studies. They definitely point in the direction of changes. But one of the problems that's been done is that they've studied people who have done meditation for sometimes 30 or 40,000 hours, which is a lot of meditating. And those people may be fundamentally different from us. We're not sure. It's like a marathon runner. If somebody runs in the Olympics, are they the same as somebody who just runs, for their own enjoyment on weekends? They may be different people. There may be something in their nature physically that's different. So it may be early at this point to try to correlate the structures and functions too tightly. I think of it, an example is I turn on my car and my engine goes on and my lights go on. But my lights have nothing to do with my engine. Now, if I were a neuroscientist, I might say that those lights, the activation of my lights, had to do with driving my car, and I would be wrong. But the fMRI studies don't distinguish the lights from the engine. So we got to be a little bit careful about trying to correlate too many things with these very at some level, crude techniques, even though they're a lot more sophisticated than they've been in the past. And there are a lot of limitations to the way these studies are done. Now, in applying meditation, we can look at physical and medical conditions. You can also look at what might be called behavioral conditions or more psychological parameters. And there are various dimensions that we can look at. Things that don't work in the physical domain, things that don't work psychologically, things that might be social dysfunctions. And most of where meditation works seems to be in our thoughts and emotions in the psychological dimension. The question about whether there are effects on the social and physical dimensions have been a lot more difficult to prove. So when a person meditates, we can see that maybe there's an effect on our thoughts and our feelings, but does it affect our body and the way the body actually works? That's actually been more difficult to show. And so we'll go through some scenarios where we can look at that. So we've got meditation in cancer. There's a large body of literature, especially with breast cancer survivors, suggesting that MBSR is very effective for improving things like anxiety, depression, stress, quality of life, and general well-being, but weaker evidence for things like markers of inflammation and health outcomes for breast cancer survivors. So we get, again, some better evidence that it affects the psychological dimensions and weaker evidence that it actually is affecting how the body is functioning. In terms of pain, there is some evidence that MBSR is good for chronic pain, but not necessarily better than other types of interventions. For something like chronic low back pain, uncertain benefit, again, for the physical component of pain, but some evidence that it may be good for pain acceptance and coping and adjustment. For heart disease, MBSR does not appear to be particularly good for hypertension, but another type of meditation called transcendental meditation, where people use a mantra, which is a sound that you just repeat again and again. There seems to be some evidence that transcendental meditation may be useful for hypertension. And they've seen these modest reductions, a few millimeters of mercury for the blood pressure, maybe not enough, for some people might be enough not to take medication, for other people probably not enough, and some benefits that seem especially to accrue in African Americans with transcendental meditation. Mindfulness might be helpful in some of the psychological dimensions, things like anxiety, depression, in patients with cardiovascular disease. In terms of mental health, which I know is a big interest of all of you here, there have been what we call randomized controlled trials, which are a sort of gold standard for doing research, where we actually are comparing two groups and we randomize people so that we're not artificially creating biases in the study. And there are many studies that show improvement in things like positive affect, empathy, mindfulness, of course we would hope for, forgiveness, self-compassion, and quality of life, and reductions in negative emotions like anxiety, depression, anger, stress, and aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was looking for things about serious mental illness. Meditation has been studied in a variety of more serious mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, OCD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, ADHD, and eating disorders. So there are studies for all of these. One of the things that I think is reassuring is that meditation can be safe in all of these settings. So in the bulk of people who have been studied, they did not have problems meditating, although the patients had to be selected to some degree. You wouldn't take people who are very actively decompensated with these conditions. And they also adjusted the practices to be more appropriate for these types of patients. The studies tended to be small, often were not very good studies from the point of view of the methodology. So unfortunately, what we can draw in terms of conclusions, a little bit less clear-cut. One of the most popular forms of a kind of meditation intervention for people with serious mental health issues is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. They found that people who were using cognitive therapy, which is one of the most successful forms of therapy for psychiatric disorders, that they still continued to have problems that were not improved just with the cognitive behavioral therapy, and they joined up mindfulness similar to MBSR with the cognitive therapy. They found that this was, and so this is again like an 8-week intervention where they use a group setting with this combined intervention. They typically use it after, at least initially it's been used after depression has improved. They're not using it as the initial intervention, but they're using it when people are stabilized. And there's good quality evidence that this type of intervention is effective in preventing recurrences in people who have over 3 or more episodes of unipolar depression. They're not bipolar, but they're just unipolar major depressions and more than 3 episodes. It actually doesn't help if you've only had 2 episodes. So it's interesting how specific they had to be in terms of the target population for this. It's also been used in reducing residual symptoms of depression after a recurrence. So sometimes when people get better after a depressive episode, they still have symptoms that might pull them back into a recurrence, and they hope to reduce those symptoms and hopefully prevent recurrences by doing that. In terms of some of the other disorders that have been looked at with meditation, there's bipolar disorder. They usually are using MBCT, that intervention we just talked about. Greatest benefits seem to be for anxiety and stress. The effects on depression are somewhat less clear, and there's no evidence that using this kind of intervention actually reduces manic episodes or time to depression. So it does, help for some of the interim symptoms, the symptoms between episodes, but not so much in terms of the episodes themselves. In terms of schizophrenics, and this is a modified practice, meaning that, for example, they did the focused breathing, but they didn't do meditations, and there are some meditations where people just let their minds go. There were concerns that if they did that, they might start hallucinating. So this is an example of just tailoring the intervention to the particular kind of problem the person has. And they did see some things like better control of psychotic symptoms and impulsive behaviors, more self-awareness and self-acceptance, reduced anxiety and withdrawal, and some reduction in hospitalization rates. So it looks, impressive. For PTSD, most of this evidence is preliminary, that it may reduce some of the PTSD symptoms and depression. And for all of these, the basic problem is that there are methodologic issues in the ways the studies that are done, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So what makes it problematic when we do these studies? Because, we kind of want to believe that the science is good. We take a group of people, the participants, and we do an intervention like meditation. And, you think, well, if something goes right, that shows meditation works, doesn't it? Well, you don't really know that, because let's say everybody got happier in those 8 weeks. Everybody in the world was just happier at that moment in time. And these people got happier, but how do you know that it's because of the meditation? It could just be that they were just like everybody else. So we usually like to have a control group, and they often are sort of as usual. Just carry on your usual life, and we'll meditate over here. Any differences are due to meditation, right? Well, there are some other issues. One is who is signing up, and can't quite see it, but we have this little segment of the population that gets into the study. Not everybody. Often people who sign up for things like meditation interventions are a little more gung-ho about doing meditation. They're not the next door neighbor who wouldn't do that, come hell or high water. That person, if they got into that study, might not enjoy meditation as much. So we select for people when we do a study to some degree, for people who are, to some degree more likely to benefit or like the intervention. So that's one problem right there. Another question is, are they randomized? If we split 2 groups into 2 groups of people, we might have, by chance, half of the group that really loves meditation going into the intervention, and the half that hates meditation going into the control group. So we have to be really careful that it's well mixed, so we don't get into that problem. The other thing is that these interventions like MBSR are not just meditation. They also are a group of people. And you probably know that support groups are very helpful for people. How do we know that it's not just a support group? So what we would want to do is have another group that's a control where they just have a support group. The only difference between the groups is the meditation. Then if this group does better, the meditation is likely to be the reason why they're better, not just because they happen to be in a group. And all of these things make it a lot more difficult to do good quality studies. And then the last thing is that the results in these kinds of studies are usually self-report. We're not looking at a blood pressure or a blood sugar. We're looking at, I feel happier, I'm more compassionate. These are things that are reported by people, but they're not really objective, so it could be difficult to know what they really mean. Now, given all of that, there was in 2014 a study that looked at psychological stress and well-being interventions using meditation. They looked at a lot of the big, major sources of studies. You probably don't know these things, maybe Medline, which is the National Library of Medicine, but they looked at 18,753 articles. They weeded them out based on the quality of the articles. Mainly, not only were they randomized controlled trials, and the randomized control we talked about a little bit about, but they also controlled for the amount of time that the control group had with the study. In other words, they weren't just, this group meditates, but they're also in a group, and this other group just go home and we'll call you back in 8 weeks. What they said is, no, the control group also had to have time spent so that we were at least taking care of the fact that you were in a group. And when they did that, only 47 trials qualify as being of sufficient quality to call them good trials. So from that, what did we find out? Well, we found out that anxiety, depression, and pain were moderately improved with meditation, and we can say that with a fair amount of confidence, but with a lot less confidence that meditation actually improves stress or distress or mental health quality of life. It's not that it didn't necessarily improve it, but the evidence, the actual proof, is not good quality. So that's what the moderate and low means. It means that we can say with pretty good confidence that this effect is real. We can't say much about this effect, and we can say very little about whether meditation has a benefit for mood, attention, substance use, eating habits, sleep, or weight. So this is really the best we know about meditation from this kind of a study. And this is the best study there is at the moment. It's what's called a meta-analysis, by the way. It's not a study in itself, but it takes the literature and reviews it and tries to make sense of it. So we have to be careful because there are a lot of people who really love meditation, including a lot of people who do research on meditation. So they're a little more invested. A lot of people who do research on meditation are meditators, and they would love to prove that meditation works. But for the reasons we just saw, we have to be a lot more judicious and careful. Now, one of the interesting things, and I imagine this will be near and dear to your heart. Oh yeah, will you pass this out? Are the burdens of being a caregiver. And you probably are aware, but being a caregiver means that you're at higher risk for emotional stress, having less time with friends and family, neglecting self-care, a healthy lifestyle like sleep, exercise, and diet, higher risks of serious illness, a much higher rate of significant depression compared to other people. A lot of people who are caregivers are spending their own money to take care of a family member, let's say. And often people who are caregivers may be people who are low-income people, so that amount that they're spending can be very important in terms of their whole budget. And a lot of caregivers don't feel that they're adequately trained to do what they're doing. And this is we're handing this out. Anybody who's a caregiver, I would encourage you to do this survey. At the bottom of it, it will give you a score. And one of the things that we learned about physicians, because physicians have a lot of burnout, is that a lot of physicians are very unaware of how burned out they are. So I think that's probably going to be true of a lot of caregivers in general. And for that reason, I would encourage you, if you're a caregiver for somebody with a mental illness or anything else, do this study, do this survey and see where you are and see if that surprises you. So can meditation help caregivers? This is actually a very recent study that was just done. This was a meta-analysis, so a study of studies just came out last month. They looked at over 1,500 articles on meditation for caregivers and for health professionals. Again, very few studies were really good quality, about 68. They found very good evidence that meditation was of benefit for depression, anxiety, stress, and what's called self-efficacy, the confidence that you can handle your situation. Not quite so good evidence for caregiver burden. And what caregiver burden is means basically doing one of these types of surveys that we just handed out, where it's more of a composite. We're not looking at a particular dimension like depression, but we're looking at the whole overview of many different parameters. All of those questions, I think it's 20 on that sheet, so it's more of a composite score. And then not very good evidence that does improving the caregiver's well-being improve the quality of care for the care recipient, the person who's getting cared for. So I think this is at least very encouraging that meditation can be good for things like depression, anxiety, stress, and the self-efficacy, and that would be really the take-home. Now, meditation can have some downsides, and it's not talked about a lot, but I think it probably will be a little bit more because people are becoming more aware of it. One thing that happens, and this happens in any type of psychotherapy, is the phenomenon of getting worse before you get better. You know, you've been sweeping a lot of things under the rug, and now suddenly you pick up the rug and it looks pretty bad. And when you're doing meditating, that's sort of like picking up the rug. So, you know, it may seem a little surprising down there, but over time it usually will start to straighten out. There can be adverse effects like anxiety, sometimes dysphoria. People don't feel great about what they're experiencing, and they get disoriented, or even a sense of their sense of self gets a little strange, and they don't feel like themselves. And that's actually not unusual in meditation, at least people who meditate a lot. Some people have had their first psychotic episodes meditating. I think people get drawn to meditation as a way to, just like to drinking and to drugs, as a way to deal with their problem, and sometimes their psychotic episode may be precipitated during meditation. And lastly, it has been reported that people with seizure disorders sometimes will have seizures during meditation, although I've never actually seen that. So there's an importance of being sure that before a person, especially a person with a serious mental health issue, starts up meditation, that everybody understands what's going on, and you have a competent trainer who really is able to work with that. I don't think I would go into this without letting somebody know if you decide to get into a program. And there are programs in this area for example, like MBSR. I think I would really let somebody know up front that, this person, let's say my son or my daughter, is being treated for, let's say, serious depression. They're in remission right now. I just really want you to be aware of this, or maybe know who the mental health worker is for that person. The last part of the talk, I want to talk about a different aspect of this type of practice, and this is about compassion. And this was a very personally meaningful thing for me, because when I retired, I found myself experiencing a lot of feelings I wasn't quite ready for, and they were not comfortable feelings for me after working for about 35 years as a physician, and I suddenly was wondering, what was I doing? And I got into taking some compassion courses that are offered in this area, and it really was an eye-opener for me and very transformative for me personally. So I want to pass that on, because I think it really has a lot of meaning for a lot of us who are caregivers. So compassion, we think of as being not only recognize recognizing other people's suffering, but it also elicits a motivation and a willingness to alleviate it. I think of it, somebody falls on the street, and almost immediately, at least for a lot of us, we would have this sense of wanting to pick that person up. To me, that's a very compassionate thing. We immediately understand it, and we immediately have a sense of what to do for it. Now, compassion isn't always that easy, because you could pass somebody on the street who is asking for money, and in some cases, there's no question that maybe that's the right thing, that would be the right thing to do. But if that person has a bottle in their hand, there may be a question about whether that's the right thing to do. So compassion is a very complex emotion, and it has thought components to it, and it has feeling components to it. Evolutionarily, there's been a lot of interest that compassion comes from our bodies, from our brains, that it's actually hardwired in and was important for evolution. And actually, Darwin was very impressed by compassion in our species and felt that a compassionate species, not just human, but other species, that compassion had survival advantages for raising our young and for collaborating and cooperating in society. And there's evidence that compassion is associated with better relationships, better mental and physical health. What's interesting biologically is we've lived in a demanding world. Most of us don't live in this world right now, but that's kind of where we came from. We have our drive and resource-seeking systems. This guy's hungry. He wants food. He's driven by, he has a drive. But, emotionally, when we have our drive system turned on, there can also be excitement, pleasure. In the brain, this is typically the dopamine systems. It's a very activating kind of part of our life. This guy is scared out of his wits. He's running for his life, fight, flight, and freeze. He wants protection and safety. His emotions could be anxiety and depression. Other systems, adrenergic, or what we call the sympathetic nervous system, and this can be inhibiting or activating. Sometimes animals freeze when they're really scared and turn off systems like your gut and your reproductive systems. So these are actually systems that can cause us a lot of distress, because this system can cause addiction and overeating and things like that. This system can cause things like anxiety and depression. But we do have a soothing, what's called affiliative system, the systems that want us to be with each other. It's a system of safeness and kindness, contentment, safety, connectedness, or the emotions that are connected to that. And the transmitters are things like endorphins, oxytocin, which are associated with bonding and soothing. What's very interesting is that there appears to be actually a biologic inhibition of these two systems that comes from this system. I think of the mother bird who has to go out and feed her chicks in the nest. She has to put down her own, let's get back to where we were. She has to be able to put down her own hunger to get food for her young. She also has to put down her own threats, the hawk that wants to come after her. So she's dealing with this stuff, but she can inhibit that because of her orientation towards the affiliation for her young. So that's actually a very powerful thing, because we have specific neural circuits that can shut down or at least moderate these other systems. And compassion training is a way to invoke or turn on those systems. Now, one of the interesting things is the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy is really, and I'm using these words in a particular way, and other people may not use them this way, but if you bear with me, just the notion of what these words could mean. Empathy often means that we mirror another person's emotions in ourselves. And unfortunately, that can be a problem, because if we're mirroring negative emotions, this caregiver whose dad has Alzheimer's disease, and she's just kind of burnt out on all of the negative stuff that comes up during the day. On the other hand, here's this compassionate young physician, and I think, just the pictures tell you a lot. she's disconnected, she's depressed, he's more connected, he wants to help this person, and he's actually reaching out. So it's engendering this not only feeling for the person, but also the motivation to do something. Somehow these two things are different. We're not sure exactly why, but they are. There's some evidence that compassion may be protective against that distress that she's feeling. In fact, there's a study, and there are other studies, but this is one, where they take two groups. One group called the affect or the feeling group. They're taught empathy first and then compassion later. The other group just learns how to remember things better. That's the control. And what they do is they show them pictures. We call it socio-affective video task. What it basically means is we show you pictures for about 20 seconds. Some of them are neutral, some of them are very distressing. And we measure your affect, positive or negative, in each stage of the study. What they found is that the empathy training increased empathy, which is good, but it also increased negative affect. When they saw these distressing pictures, they felt even worse. But when they got the compassion training after the empathy training, it completely zeroed out the negative effect of the empathy training. And in fact, their positive affect was increased even when they were seeing these distressing pictures. The compassion training actually made them more able to be with distressing things than they were before. What's also interesting is that when you look at the brain, the empathy training increased areas of the brain associated with what are known to be empathic pain areas. When you feel bad about something, these are the areas that light up. That's what empathy does. But when they got the compassion training, completely different areas of the brain lit up. These are areas that are associated with love, positive affect, and reward. So a completely different neural signature in the brain associated with compassion than with empathy. Now, another part of the compassion story that I think is interesting is a big interest recently in self-compassion. I think of this as a sort of reverse golden rule, that we actually do unto ourselves as we would have ourselves do unto others. We can be very kind to other people. We can be very hard on ourselves. You know, if you look at how you talk to yourself or listen to how you talk to yourself, are you ever saying, boy, I was so stupid, I'm such a schmuck, or, you know, or whatever. When those kinds of things come up, you might realize that those are things we would not usually say to other people. I mean, we might, in which case we've got bigger problems. But I think a lot of us, especially caregivers, will often, you know, point a lot of negative feelings at themselves that they would never point at people they care for. So there's a lot of interest in self-compassion, and Kristen Neff, who is a researcher in this area, defined these elements. Mindfulness, recognizing that I'm having a hard time. A lot of times we kind of skip over that step and immediately go to, how do I fix this feeling? I don't feel good right now. That's implicit, but what do I do to not feel bad? So mindfulness is the recognition, I'm having a hard time right now. Common humanity, which is, it's only human to feel the way I feel. I'm not alone in feeling this way. I'm not just like one in a million who happens to be unable to take care of myself. A lot of people might feel this way. And then the self-kindness piece, which is a kind of invocation, whether you believe it or not. These kinds of statements like, may I be kind to myself, may I be okay with this, may I be happy and at peace. We can use these kinds of statements to almost fake it till we make it, which is that we use these statements and mindfulness and common humanity to begin to develop a sense of compassion for ourselves. And it's strongly linked to well-being. It's not the same as self-pity, self-indulgence, or laziness, which are often removing us from common humanity, where we see ourselves as less or more than other people. We're actually seeing ourselves just like other people, deserving the same sort of relationship that we would like, we would typically have for other people who are in distress. Now, compassion can be trained, and I was very lucky in that I actually took these two courses. This one at Stanford, compassion cultivation training, both about 8-9 week programs, and mindful self-compassion, which is a new program that is being given at El Camino Hospital. And if anybody's really interested, I can tell you how to look for those. So they're basic mindfulness training, but with much more emphasis on compassion. And the studies, the randomized controlled trials, RCTs, show a lot of improvement in compassion and some in the mindfulness, improvement in happiness, life satisfaction, connectedness, and reduction in some of those negative emotions like anxiety, depression, and worry. When we look at this a little bit more carefully in terms of some of the ways that we've looked at the studies before, this is an overview study, a meta-analysis, and they basically see that there are benefits: decreased depression, increased compassion, and positive emotions. Those things do look like real improvements. Less so for things like decreasing anger, anxiety, and stress, and no benefit, interestingly, for things like well-being and quality of life. But it may be, just as in the other studies, that we just need better quality studies to see the effects. And so this is the question, and we'll have to just wait and see. In terms of studies in medicine and using compassion as a medical intervention, there have only been a couple of studies done, so we're really at the infancy of that. And then the recognition that compassion, in this case they call it kindness-based meditation or compassion practices, are actually more challenging than mindfulness. It often takes people quite a while to be able to let themselves be compassionate towards themselves in particular, and that therefore, it's just more difficult. It takes longer for people to develop those qualities. I just want to mention that there are a lot of resources on the web. These are some, and I could probably get these to you if you're interested. If you look up things like meditation or mindfulness or compassion meditations and MP3 or something like that, you can find lots of recorded meditations on the internet. There are also some iPhone apps which are quite nice, and these happen to be some free ones. And then I just want to summarize by saying we've covered a lot of ground. Meditation, I think, does hold a lot of promise as a practice for well-being, mental, physical, and social wellness. Tremendous amount of new and very exciting information coming from neuroscience that hopefully not only will give us insight into the mechanisms, but may actually improve the way we do meditation. And I think we're actually beginning to see a few of those things coming up now. A vast body of research, as we've seen, but not the quality that we would like, to be able to apply it as well as we might like in clinical and other settings. I think meditation, as we're doing it now, has, to some degree, we do it the way we take vitamins. We sort of take the good stuff and make it into a pill, and now we're sort of doing that with meditation, where we make it into a very precise intervention. But meditation for thousands of years was done as part of a way of life. And I think that it's really important not to try to just take meditation, as a fix for being very stressed out, but to deal with other things like stress in a much more holistic way. And then finally, compassion, which to me is the sort of jewel, the hidden jewel that really has tremendous potential for improving happiness and resilience to stress. We just are beginning the studies, but I think we're going to anticipate a lot of potential benefits, especially for caregivers as well as for other people. So I don't know if we have any time, but if there is any time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was very